In the autumn of 1921, on the eastern edge of the United States, a Japanese naval officer walked through industrial cities whose scale defied the categories of his own professional education, observing rail yards that stretched beyond the horizon, factories operating in uninterrupted shifts, and ports where ships were built, repaired, and launched with a rhythm that suggested permanence rather than urgency. The officer was Isoroku Yamamoto, then in his mid-30s, recently graduated from Harvard University and soon to serve as naval attaché in Washington. He did not travel as a tourist or diplomat in search of impressions, but as a trained analyst absorbing the structure of a society that converted population, capital, and organization into material power without visible strain. What he saw was not simply wealth, but elasticity, a system capable of expanding without ideological crisis or institutional paralysis. Yamamoto's time in America coincided with his exposure to its political culture, which he studied with the same attention he gave to shipyards and oil refineries. He observed congressional debates that appeared chaotic, yet produced binding decisions, elections that replaced leaders without destabilizing policy, and a public sphere that tolerated dissent without weakening state authority. To many in Tokyo, these traits signified decadence and softness. To Yamamoto, they indicated resilience. Democracy, as practiced in the United States, did not inhibit mobilization, but legitimized it, transforming participation into consent rather than compulsion. He noted that American citizens argued fiercely in peacetime, yet closed ranks once war became unavoidable, a pattern confirmed by the nation's response to earlier conflicts. By the early 1930s, Yamamoto had risen to senior command within the Imperial Japanese Navy, and his conclusions hardened into warnings. He did not argue that Japan would lose a short war against the United States. He argued that no short war was possible. American industrial capacity, once activated, would overwhelm Japan regardless of tactical brilliance or initial success. Oil production, steel output, shipbuilding tonnage, and population reserves all pointed in one direction, and Yamamoto understood that wars between industrial powers were decided not by decisive battles alone, but by sustained replacement of losses. He repeatedly stated that Japan could fight for 6 months, perhaps a year, but beyond that point, outcomes would be dictated by arithmetic rather than courage. These assessments placed Yamamoto in quiet opposition to prevailing assumptions within Japan's military leadership, which regarded America as a fragmented, comfort-seeking society incapable of enduring prolonged sacrifice. Yamamoto did not dispute American individualism, he disputed its strategic interpretation. He had seen how quickly individual ambition could be subordinated to national purpose once the political threshold was crossed. His experience did not make him a pacifist, but it made him precise. If war came, he insisted, Japan would be gambling its future on an opponent whose true strength lay not in any single fleet or weapon, but in the depth of its system. By the late 1930s, as Japan drifted closer to confrontation, Yamamoto found himself increasingly isolated, respected for his competence, yet ignored in his conclusions. The leadership accepted his operational skill while discounting the implications of his analysis. What remained unresolved, and what Yamamoto understood with growing clarity, was that the decision to fight the United States was being made by men who had never truly measured the society they were about to awaken. In May 1905, in the narrow waters of the Tsushima Strait, the Imperial Japanese Navy annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet in a battle that would echo through Japanese strategic thinking for decades, shaping assumptions far beyond the circumstances that had produced it. The victory was decisive, rapid, and asymmetric. A modern, well-prepared Japanese fleet destroyed a numerically impressive but exhausted Russian force that had sailed halfway around the world, plagued by mechanical failures, poor training, and political decay at home.
At the center of the engagement stood Togo Heihachiro, whose precise maneuvering and gunnery coordination delivered a result that appeared to confirm the supremacy of will, discipline, and surprise over size and resources. What Japanese planners absorbed from Tsushima, however, was not the specific chain of enabling conditions that had made victory possible, but a simplified abstraction that a single decisive naval battle could neutralize a materially stronger opponent before that opponent's full strength could be brought to bear. In the years that followed, Tsushima was elevated from historical event to strategic template, taught in staff colleges as proof that bold initiative and concentrated force could compensate for industrial inferiority. The fact that Russia in 1905 was politically unstable, logistically overextended, and technologically uneven was gradually subordinated to a narrative in which moral superiority and tactical audacity determined outcomes. This interpretation ignored the contingency of the original victory. The Russian fleet had arrived depleted, its crews exhausted, its ammunition inferior, its command structure rigid and unresponsive. Japan, by contrast, had fought near its home waters, supported by secure logistics, coherent doctrine, and years of focused preparation for precisely such an encounter. Tsushima was not a demonstration of a universal law of war, but the convergence of favorable conditions that could not be reliably reproduced against every adversary. Yet within Japanese strategic culture, the battle came to represent a timeless principle rather than a context-bound outcome. By the interwar period, this lesson hardened into institutional belief. Naval doctrine increasingly emphasized the concept of kantai kessen, the decisive fleet engagement, in which an enemy navy would be lured across the Pacific, attrited by submarines and air attacks, and finally destroyed in a climactic battle near Japan. The United States was unconsciously substituted for Russia in this framework, despite fundamental differences in geography, industrial depth, and political cohesion. The assumption that America would obligingly concentrate its forces and accept decisive battle under unfavorable conditions was rarely questioned at the strategic level. What Tsushima ultimately provided was confidence without calibration. It encouraged Japanese leaders to believe that history could be repeated through resolve alone, and that surprise could permanently offset disparity in production and manpower. By transforming a singular victory into doctrine, Japan mistook precedent for prediction. The intellectual comfort drawn from Tsushima postponed harder questions about sustainability, replacement, and escalation, questions that would resurface only after the war had already begun, when the conditions that made Tsushima possible no longer existed, and the opponent awaiting Japan across the Pacific bore little resemblance to the one defeated in 1905.
By the mid-1930s, Japan's strategic worldview had hardened into a closed system of assumptions in which Western democracies were interpreted less as political structures than as cultural weaknesses. Within military academies, staff colleges, and internal policy memoranda, the United States was increasingly described as a society incapable of sustained sacrifice, fragmented by class conflict, racial tension, labor unrest, and electoral politics that allegedly paralyzed decisive action. American wealth was acknowledged, but it was framed as softness rather than strength, a surplus presumed to erode discipline and will. Material abundance in this logic produced complacency, while hardship produced resolve, an equation that required no empirical testing once it was accepted as cultural truth. This interpretation drew selectively from Japan's own ideological evolution. The belief that national unity flowed from hierarchy, obedience, and spiritual discipline encouraged the conclusion that societies organized around individual choice and political competition must necessarily fracture under pressure. Democratic debate was read not as a mechanism for consensus, but as evidence of disunity. Dissent was treated as disloyalty rather than as part of a functioning political system. In internal discussions, American elections were cited as proof that leadership could change unpredictably,
while the Japanese system was praised for continuity, overlooking the fact that continuity did not guarantee coherence. Racial and cultural stereotypes reinforced this analytical failure. Americans were frequently depicted in internal military writings as commercially minded, comfort-seeking, and unwilling to endure casualties for abstract goals. Such characterizations replaced rigorous assessment of institutional capacity with moral judgment. The possibility that a pluralistic society could mobilize more effectively precisely because it integrated diverse interests into a shared national framework was rarely considered. The distinction between peacetime disagreement and wartime alignment was blurred or ignored entirely. Crucially, this worldview discounted the stabilizing effect of American political legitimacy. Japanese planners assumed that high casualties or early setbacks would fracture public support and force negotiation, underestimating the degree to which an external attack could unify a divided electorate. The assumption that democratic societies lacked endurance rested on observation without context, mistaking the visibility of debate for absence of resolve. What appeared as weakness in peacetime masked a capacity for rapid psychological consolidation once a clear threat emerged. Within this framework, dissenting analysis found little traction. Warnings that American society could absorb shock and convert outrage into mobilization conflicted with entrenched beliefs about cultural hierarchy and moral fortitude. Strategic planning increasingly reflected what leaders expected America to be rather than what it demonstrably was. By substituting cultural contempt for structural analysis, Japan's leadership transformed misunderstanding into policy, setting the stage for decisions based not on measured capability but on assumed fragility, an assumption that would be tested only after the threshold of war had already been crossed. By 1940, Japan's strategic horizon was increasingly defined not by opportunity but by constraint, as the expansion of the war in China collided with the material limits of an island empire dependent on external supply. Oil was the central variable. Japan imported more than 80% of its petroleum, the majority of it from the United States, and this dependence shaped every serious internal assessment of future operations. Fuel was not an abstract commodity but a finite countdown, measured in stockpiles that could sustain the fleet and air forces for only a limited number of months once imports ceased. This reality was understood at the technical level, documented in naval and army planning papers, yet its political implications were repeatedly deferred. The tightening of American economic pressure in 1940 and 1941, culminating in the freezing of Japanese assets and the effective oil embargo, was interpreted in Tokyo less as a signal to reassess strategic objectives than as confirmation that time itself had become the enemy. Diplomatic options narrowed rapidly, but the narrowing was psychological as much as material. Within the Japanese leadership, the embargo was framed as coercion designed to strangle Japan into submission, reinforcing the belief that retreat from China or Southeast Asia would represent national humiliation and strategic collapse. War, in this framing, became not one option among several, but the only remaining assertion of agency. What was largely absent from these deliberations was a sustained examination of what victory over the United States would require beyond the initial phase. Planning focused on securing access to resources in Southeast Asia, particularly oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, under the assumption that acquisition would translate directly into endurance. Less attention was given to the vulnerability of supply lines, the time required to repair and operate captured facilities, or the scale of American naval and industrial response once war began. The logic of necessity displaced the logic of feasibility. Internal military assessments often acknowledged that even successful Southern expansion would not guarantee long-term parity with the United States. These conclusions, however, were subordinated to a broader consensus that delay was fatal, and that decisive action, however risky, was preferable to strategic paralysis. The embargo thus functioned not only as an economic constraint, but as a catalyst that compressed decision-making, rewarding boldness over calculation. War planning became an exercise in managing immediate shortages rather than confronting structural imbalance. By late 1941, Japan's leadership had accepted a paradox of its own making, that war with the United States was unavoidable, yet unwinnable in a prolonged form. The hope, rarely articulated explicitly, was that rapid success would force a negotiated settlement before material realities asserted themselves. It was a strategy built not on dominance, but on timing, and on the assumption that the opponent's political will would fracture under pressure before industrial momentum could be fully unleashed.
On the morning of December 7, 1941, at 07:48 local time, the first wave of Japanese carrier aircraft descended over Pearl Harbor, achieving complete tactical surprise against an American fleet anchored in what was believed to be a secure rear area. The operation unfolded with precision. Battleships were struck at their moorings, airfields were hit to prevent interception, and within hours the harbor was littered with burning hulls, sinking vessels, and aircraft destroyed on the ground. From an operational perspective, the attack achieved nearly everything its planners had intended in the opening phase, delivering a concentrated blow that temporarily neutralized American naval power in the Central Pacific. Yet the material results of the attack were more limited than the initial images suggested. While 8 battleships were damaged and 4 sunk, the majority were later salvaged and returned to service. Critically, American aircraft carriers were not present in the harbor, having been deployed at sea and thus survived intact. Equally important, the infrastructure that sustained naval operations, fuel storage tanks, dry docks, repair facilities, and logistical depots, remained largely untouched. The Japanese strike force withdrew without attempting a third wave that might have targeted these assets, a decision driven by concern over American counterattack and the limits of operational endurance rather than by strategic oversight alone. The deeper failure of Pearl Harbor lay not in what it destroyed, but in what it provoked. Rather than shocking the United States into negotiation, the attack resolved internal political divisions with remarkable speed. Within hours, uncertainty gave way to consensus. Congressional debate collapsed into near-unanimous support for war, and public opinion shifted from isolationist caution to sustained mobilization. The psychological effect assumed by Japanese planners, a fractured democracy recoiling from loss, did not materialize. Instead, the attack transformed an abstract geopolitical dispute into a direct national grievance. From a strategic standpoint, Pearl Harbor committed Japan irrevocably to a war of production and endurance against an opponent whose industrial mobilization now operated without political restraint. The destruction inflicted was real, but it did not alter the fundamental balance of resources. American shipyards began replacing losses at a pace that rendered the initial success temporary, while Japan lacked the capacity to escalate beyond the opening blow. What had been conceived as a preemptive strike to secure strategic freedom instead fixed the trajectory of the war along lines Japan was least equipped to sustain. In the days that followed, as Japanese forces advanced rapidly across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the implications of Pearl Harbor were already becoming clear. The United States had not been broken or deterred, but unified and activated, and the window of advantage purchased by surprise was narrowing faster than anticipated, pointing toward a confrontation where time itself would become the decisive adversary.
The first confirmation of Japan's miscalculation arrived not through a decisive battle, but through an unexpected demonstration of reach. On April 18, 1942, American B-25 bombers struck Tokyo and other cities in the Doolittle Raid, an operation of limited material effect but profound strategic implication. The raid revealed that the Pacific was not a protective barrier, but a contested space, and that American forces were willing to accept operational risk to impose psychological and political costs. For Japanese leaders, the event undermined assumptions about perimeter security and exposed gaps between territorial expansion and effective defense. The more decisive confirmation followed in June 1942 at the Battle of Midway, where Japanese carrier strength was irreversibly damaged in a matter of hours. 4 fleet carriers were lost, along with experienced air crews that could not be replaced at comparable speed. The battle was not simply a tactical defeat, it was an industrial verdict. American losses were absorbed and replaced, while Japan's carrier aviation, dependent on a narrow training pipeline and limited production, entered a downward trajectory from which it would not recover. The logic of Kantai-Kessen collapsed under the weight of asymmetric replacement rates. The campaign that followed on Guadalcanal further translated disparity into attrition. What began as a local contest became a prolonged struggle over airfields, sea lanes, and supply endurance. American forces, though inexperienced, rotated units, repaired losses, and expanded logistical throughput. Japanese forces fought with discipline and determination, but without the material elasticity required to sustain losses. Each engagement consumed assets that could not be restored, converting tactical stalemates into strategic erosion. Throughout 1943 and 1944, the pattern intensified. American shipyards launched carriers and escorts in numbers that exceeded Japan's total pre-war inventory, while aircraft production expanded beyond any plausible countermeasure. Training systems matured, standardization improved, and operational learning compounded rather than dissipated. Japanese industry, constrained by raw materials, transportation bottlenecks, and bombing, could not match scale or tempo. The imbalance that Isoroku Yamamoto had warned of ceased to be theoretical and became operational fact. By the time Japan recognized that initiative had been lost permanently, the outcome was already determined by cumulative arithmetic. Battles remained to be fought and lives to be lost, but the decisive variable was no longer maneuver or surprise, it was replacement. The war concluded not with a single catastrophic defeat, but with the exhaustion of options produced by an initial decision that misread the nature of the opponent. The strategic error lay not in underestimating American weapons, but in misunderstanding the society that produced them.